Hi everyone, welcome to the channel. My name is Dr. Samantha Munroe, and in this video I'm going to share with you the #1 reasons that a paper gets rejected without review and what you can do to prevent it. Hello everyone. If you are new to the channel, I'm Dr. Sam Munroe and I am an ecologist. That means I study plants and animals and how they interact with their environment. I have studied all sorts of wildlife, everything from sharks to shrimps to shrubs. And here on YouTube, I like to talk about ecology in the media, what it's like to be a scientist, and things that you can do to build a scientific career. If your research paper has been rejected by a journal without review, then you are not alone. This kind of rejection is incredibly common, but also enormously frustrating. It is so painful when you send a paper in for review only to have an editor toss it back to you, and usually they don't provide a lot of explanation as to why your paper got rejected. Well, there are actually a few major reasons that you can get a desk rejection, and we're going to talk about them in this video. Now, you might be wondering what makes me qualified to give this advice. Well, besides being an academic myself, I am also an academic editor for the journal PLOS One. That means I have been in the painful position of having to tell people that their paper is being rejected without review. And I can also tell you that there are a number of reasons pretty consistently why I have to make that decision. Before we get into why a particular paper might get rejected, I think it's useful to talk about what it's like to be an academic editor for a journal and what the review process is behind the scenes. So what is an academic editor for a journal? Well, an academic editor is someone with expertise in a particular discipline or area of research. And every time somebody submits a paper to a journal, that paper gets assigned to an academic editor, and it's their job to move it through the review process. When I get sent an invitation to handle a manuscript as an editor, the very first thing I do is I read that manuscript over a few times to determine whether or not I'm even qualified to review it. If I do accept the assignment because I feel qualified, I then read the paper over a few times to determine whether or not it should be sent out for review. At this stage, I'm looking for fatal flaws in the paper, things that mean there's absolutely no way it would make it through review successfully. If I do decide to send it out for review, I now need to find at least 2 reviewers who can read the paper and offer feedback to help me decide whether or not it should be published. It is rare that an academic editor is going to know everything about a topic for a particular paper. I'm an expert in a few things, but a paper might cover a variety of different topics that I don't necessarily have experience in. That's why reviewers are so important. What I'm looking for in a reviewer is somebody who can give me a different perspective and may have different expertise than I do to contribute to the review and ultimately the decision on whether or not to publish the paper. The trouble is, in order to find 2 reviewers, I usually need to invite at least 10 scientists to potentially review the paper. Most people, when invited to review a paper, don't accept. When I eventually get the reviews back, which can take several weeks, I then read the reviews, go through the paper again, pull all of the information that I now have together, and make a decision about whether the paper should be published in its current form, needs to undergo revision, or will be rejected. On average, an academic editor like myself will probably be sent about 1 to 4 papers to handle as an editor every month. That's a lot of papers if I were to accept every single invitation. So one of the reasons that desk rejections are so common is because editors get inundated with requests to review manuscripts, and it's way more than they could handle every month. With all that in mind, here are the main reasons why your manuscript was probably rejected without review and what you can do to stop it from happening again. The #1 reason that papers get rejected before they make it to review is because they have some sort of fatal flaw, either in the analysis or the conclusions. The most common problem that I see is people using analysis that is not appropriate for their data, or they've performed the analysis incorrectly. One of the reasons this tends to happen is because people have too small of a sample size for a particular type of statistical analysis, but they go ahead and they try and do it anyway, and it just doesn't work. Another fatal flaw can be when your methods are too vague. If I can't understand what you did and how you did it, the reviewers certainly aren't going to understand it either, and I will reject it for that reason. These types of problems where there's issues with the data or the description of how you did the study, sometimes the only way to fix these is to send it back to the author, have them rewrite it more clearly, or adjust their analysis to make it appropriate for their data. Another fatal flaw that will get you rejected is when the conclusions of the paper really overreach compared to what the analysis is showing. This could be a situation where your conclusions completely do not match at all what your data is actually telling you, or you're just exaggerating the strength of your findings. The good news is, if this is why you've been rejected, this is actually much easier to fix. Just go back, reevaluate your discussion and conclusion, and make sure you tone it down and line it up better with what your results actually showed. The second biggest reason that a paper will be rejected without review is plagiarism. Now, I say plagiarism, but plagiarism is relatively rare. It is rare, at least I have not encountered people straight copying somebody else's work. But what I do see from time to time is a more subtle kind of plagiarism called self-plagiarism. This is when an author is writing probably a couple papers using a similar data set, using a similar methodology, and they more or less copy the method section of one paper into another because, hey, why not? It's the same, right? Wrong. It may not seem fair, but self-plagiarism is still technically plagiarism, and they do have software, journals have software that can detect when this has happened because they're just looking for overlapping sections or similarities between journals. To avoid self-plagiarism, you really want to make sure if you're submitting papers that have similar data sets that you're asking very different questions of that data and you're doing different analysis. It's okay if some of the methods are the same between papers, but you do not want to copy and paste anything that you're writing between those papers, even if you're copying off yourself. The third reason your paper may have been rejected without review is because you chose the wrong journal. Different journals target different audiences, so it's very important that you make sure you submit your paper to the right audience and therefore the right journal. If the editor feels that your paper doesn't match up with the journal's aims and scope, you will likely be rejected without review. So before you choose a journal to submit to, make sure you carefully go over the aims and scope of that journal. It's also worth having a look at the last few editions of that journal to see what types of papers they have published. If you can find things that have a similar theme or scale to the work that you've done, it's probably a good fit. But if your paper seems really different to everything else that's in there, it's probably not the right journal for you. But keep in mind that sometimes even when you choose the right journal, you might still get rejected for reason number 4. Reason number 4 your paper may have been rejected without review: it wasn't considered impactful or novel. I really hate this one. Some journals are very focused on ensuring that the papers that they accept are considered extremely novel and highly impactful in the discipline. So journals like Nature and Science are really only going to accept papers that meet that very high standard. And for most of us, most of the time, those just aren't going to be the right journals for us. But even journals with a lower, or shall we say, more achievable impact factor will still sometimes reject papers on the basis of impact and novelty. This particular tripwire is actually fairly hard to avoid because it's pretty subjective on the part of the editor. They are the one deciding whether or not they believe your work is impactful and novel. The best way to convince them that it is in the cover letter. But we're going to talk about why cover letters are so important later on in the video. Having said all that, I am personally not a big fan of this reason for rejection. I think that if a paper fits the aims and scope of a journal and is scientifically sound, it deserves an opportunity to go out for a review. If you get this reason for rejection, just try and stay positive. It usually doesn't mean that you have a bad paper. It just means that this journal didn't think it was quite the right fit. Possibly they had so many submissions that they had to find a reason to cut this one. Just pick yourself back up, choose another journal, and resubmit. Reason number 5 that your article may have been rejected without review is because you submitted the wrong type of manuscript. Most journals will accept a variety of article formats. There's the traditional format, which has an introduction, methods, results, and discussion, a typical research paper. But there's other types as well, like literature reviews, where an author doesn't necessarily do any data analysis, but they review a broad subject in their field and provide an interesting or unique perspective on the state of research in their field. Another type of article is called a case study, sometimes referred to as a short communication or short report. These are used when someone has observed an interesting phenomena, or they have a more qualitative bit of data, something that isn't necessarily statistical, they haven't done any analysis on it, but it's still they want to share it with the wider research community. One of the common problems that I see is people often submit things as a research article when they really don't have enough data to do so, and they probably should have submitted something as a short communication or report. And small sample sizes and descriptive observational studies are really common in some fields, including in my own field of ecology, and having that kind of study shouldn't deter you from submitting a manuscript. You just need to make sure you submit it as the right kind of manuscript. Reason number 6 that your manuscript may have been rejected without review is because it was poorly written. This one is pretty simple. A manuscript has to be written in a good enough quality that I can understand what you did, how you did it, and why you did it. If the writing is not to a certain quality where I can relatively easily understand what was done, it's going to be rejected. This doesn't mean that you have to be Shakespeare, but I do need to be able to understand what was done, how it was done, and what it all means. And if it's not easy for me to understand that, I'm not going to send it to reviewers because they are also going to struggle to understand it. Now, I want to take a moment just to pause and acknowledge my enormous unearned privilege in this space. For really terrible colonial reasons that we don't have time to discuss in this video properly, English is the language used by a lot of the big name journals in science and most fields in academia in general. What that means is if English is your second language or you don't speak English at all, there's still tremendous pressure on you to try and publish your research in an English language journal. Those of us who were raised in countries where English was the main language are at an enormous and, as I say, unearned advantage in this space, and it really isn't fair. All that being said, if you're publishing in a journal, the quality of the language, regardless of what language it is in, has to be of a sufficient quality that the work can be understood. So if there's concerns about the quality of the language, make sure somebody who is a native speaker of that language or just someone who speaks that language really well can edit and review that paper. And if you are someone who is a really good writer and speaks the native language that someone is trying to publish in, review the paper. Be nice, be generous, edit the paper. And don't do it so that you can try and be an author. Just do it to be a good person, right? We need more generosity in science. I'm actually going to put some links to some really interesting articles on English language bias in science and academia and what a big problem it truly is. I really encourage everyone to check those out. Reason number 7 that your paper may have been rejected without review is because it didn't tell a good story. This one might seem a little strange because you're thinking you're writing a scientific manuscript. Why do you need to write a story? But all writing is storytelling, including scientific writing. When you submit a paper for publication, the editor is looking for a good story. They know that if that story is enjoyable and interesting, it's going to get a lot more readership and hopefully more citations. To tell a good story, you need to have a clear hypothesis and well thought out research questions. You also need to provide a good context for your research. What's going on in the broader discipline, and how does your work fit into it? At the end of the paper, you need to explain why your results matter and how they contribute to the field, and ultimately, what it all means. In short, you want to craft an engaging narrative with a clear justification for your study and explain why your work has made a difference. If the rationale behind your study is weak, it's very likely that the editor will reject it without review. And as a side note, saying that your work has never been done before and using that as a justification, I'm gonna level with you, it's a really bad justification. I'm assuming that no one has ever done this particular study before. Otherwise, why did you do it?
Any of your scientists working on anything new?
All of them. That's their job.
Also, it is perfectly valid to redo someone else's work if you want to double check their analysis. This is something we should probably be doing a lot more of in science. So you don't have to be the first person to do something to justify submitting a paper. Just tell me why your work is valuable. That's the most important thing. Finally, reason number 8 that your manuscript may have been rejected without review is that your cover letter and/or the abstract were poorly written. When an editor is deciding whether or not to send a paper out for review, the abstract and cover letter will weigh heavily on their decision. The abstract provides, or at least it should provide, the editor with an easy-to-understand synopsis of your project. It needs to be simple enough that somebody who is knowledgeable in your field, but perhaps not an expert, can understand what you did and what the results were. In contrast, the cover letter should explain why your research matters, why it will be valuable to the discipline, and why your paper fits the aims and scopes of the journal. Remember that these are the first 2 pieces of your submission that an editor is going to read. It's usually what they use to base their final decision on whether or not to send your paper out for review. So don't leave it to the very end. And if you do them at the end, make sure you do a good job. Make sure you put some energy and effort into the abstract, and in particular the cover letter. Don't get lazy with the cover letter. All right, everyone, those are my top pieces of advice for why your paper may have been rejected without review and how to avoid it. Let me know in the comments below, what was your most painful rejection? Academic, not real life. If you found this useful, please make sure to like, share, and subscribe, and hit the bell to get notified about more videos about having a career in STEM. I don't know if this is my most painful rejection, but probably the fastest rejection I ever had was under 10 hours. I submitted a paper at like 6 or 7 p.m. in Australia, and I woke up at 6 a.m. and it had already been rejected by the editor. And I looked at the timestamp on the email and it was like 4 a.m. So I think what happened was the editor was in North America, and while I was sleeping, they were rejecting my paper. So that was definitely the fastest one I ever had. I think one of the ones that bothered me the most was I had a paper rejected for not being impactful enough, right? And the editors sent the rejection, but they got the species wrong. So I had submitted a paper about a particular shark species and they didn't think anyone would care about it. But then they didn't even get that right in the rejection letter. They put the wrong species in the rejection letter. So I guess he really didn't care at all about that species.